Welcome back to the channel. Chris Morrison, Gulfside Ministries, here with Tim Nichols again today. Thank you for being with us again, Tim.
My pleasure. Glad to be here.
So we are back with Hebrews 2 as we work our way through this book. We got all the way through Hebrews 1 last time, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what we want to do is, for anybody who's watching, if you haven't already, obviously subscribe stuff. That way we're doing these videos, hopefully with these live here pretty soon. So we'll watch the community tab. We'll let you know when those are gonna be. But watch any background videos that you need. So we're up to where we are, but we're gonna jump right on into Hebrews 2. Tim, anything you want to add or quick before we go ahead and get going?
Nah, I mean, right now it's easy. There's only one background video.
Nice. That's exactly right. So very good. All right. Well, in that case, I've already got Hebrews 2 pulled up, but I don't want the New International Version, the nearly inspired version, right? Let's do the New King James. That's the one we like, right?
The actually inspired. I'm sorry.
Do you have a preferred translation? We used the NKJV last time.
Yeah, I mean, that's my preference. That's just for a variety of reasons, starting with the fact that I started using it when I was in 4th grade.
There you go. Hey, something being used to something. All right. Well, in that case, Tim, I'm just going to kind of hush and just let you start walking us through the passage. We'll kind of work right through it kind of as we do. How's that? Go ahead. Take it off. Take it away, sir.
All right. So let's look at 1 through 4 of chapter 2. So in the lead up to this, what he's done is make the case that Jesus is superior to the angels, but he doesn't make that case just purely out of his deity. He makes the case out of his messiahship, out of his having stepped into the role that God had for him, and having earned a more excellent name than the angels, not just already automatically having it.
Mm-hmm.
And then he turns this into the warning. Like, Hebrews is famous for its warnings.
Right.
And this is the one that sets the tone for all the rest of them.
And let me just be clear, so anybody who's not a Hebrews expert doesn't already know this. There are 5 warning passages in Hebrews, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there are 10. Obviously, oftentimes what we tend to do in Hebrews 6 is probably the most famous, and then maybe followed by 10, is where we'll tend to read this one Hebrews passage and debate what it means. And what you're going to suggest is these warning passages not only need to be read in context, but the tone, they need to be understood kind of collectively together. They're all going to contribute to a single point. Is that the position you're going to take?
Yeah, I would say that most of the problems that, the trouble you can get in Hebrews 6 and Hebrews 10, the solutions are right there in Hebrews 6 and Hebrews 10, but it does help to keep the context of the whole book in mind. Sure. And he sets the tone for the kind of book. I mean, imagine receiving the epistle. They're going to read this in a church.
Right.
And you get through the first chapter, and then the next thing he has to say, and this is going to be the pattern all the way through the book, is he's going to have a teaching section where he lays out some doctrine, and then he's going to give you a warning.
Right.
So it's a little bit like that Pauline Ephesians sort of, here's the doctrine, now here's the practice kind of structure, except that in this case, it's here's the doctrine, here's the warning.
Right. Very good. All right.
And so we're diving right into, okay, the angels are ministering spirits, but the Son is something else entirely.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the backdrop against which then he says, therefore we must give the more earnest heed to the things which we have heard, lest we drift away.
Mm-hmm.
And why the more earnest heed? Because he's making a lesser to greater argument, which he unpacks in the next verse. For if the word spoken through angels proved steadfast, and every transgression and disobedience received a just reward, how shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation, which at the first began to be spoken by the Lord? And let's stop there for a second.
Yeah.
So if Jesus is greater than all of these ministering spirits, if Jesus has obtained a more excellent name by inheritance than they ever had, then what would it mean for us to neglect what he has given us? And for a basis of comparison, what did it mean to neglect the word spoken through angels? The law, we're told, was mediated by angels. Stephen talks about this in his speech, right before the Sanhedrin.
Mhm.
We received the law at the hands of angels and have not kept it.
Right.
Like we know what happens if you disobeyed the law. We
Right.
can look through the Old Testament and read what God did with them when they stepped away from the covenant.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's all
So
serious disciplinary passages. I remember the Korah opens up and Korah, the ground
you're
opens up
right.
and takes people out. And there's the
The
guy,
earth opens up. God whistles up the Chaldeans. There's lots of,
lots of
the
examples.
Midianites come in. There's lots of trouble for being that person, right?
Right.
And so the point that he's writing to people who know those stories backwards and forwards.
Right.
These are Christians whose Bible has been the Old Testament, and they grew up Jewish
Mhm.
for decades now.
Right.
And if we understand who Jesus is relative to the angels and the difference in relative position there, and then we're asking the question, what happens if we neglect what Jesus gave us? That ought to curl your hair a little.
Yeah, sure. And that seems to me, again, there's a couple of verbs here that, again, you can comment on these now or later. I'm noticing, so we've already mentioned about being more earnest, perhaps, but I'm thinking especially about drifting away. And then the word you just highlighted is neglecting. So there seems like a connection between drifting away and then neglecting here.
Yes. Well, and the drift away is important because it implies the possibility of something that should worry you maybe a little more. I mean, in the time that we're in, well, I'm not going to have a very public breakup with Jesus on Instagram.
Yeah.
Well, okay. That's, good. That's good. But what about just drifting away?
Mhm.
What about not making a hard break, not making a big public statement? What about you just you notice if you hang out with the Christians, people look at you funny.
Yeah.
So you kind of just quit going to those parties. You quit showing up at those places. You don't talk about those things. It doesn't take a lot of effort. In fact, it takes a lot less effort.
Right. And I think that there's something to this connection between, first of all, drifting is a slow process. I'm assuming that that's as intentional in English as anywhere else. It's not something that happens. You can tend not to notice it, right? And so the response is taking earnest heed of the things we have heard, lest we drift away. So it's like, let's be intentional, because there's a real risk of waking up one day and realizing that I'm not where I used to be or thought I was.
Yes, and we're going to get into this in 3 and 4 when he uses the Exodus generation as an example. And what we'll see, I'm cheating a little bit on my boundaries here, but what we'll see when we get there is that God's diagnosis of the climactic moment of Israel's failure is different from the way we would diagnose it just reading through the Torah. We would put the climactic moment at which they failed and God's judgment fell in a certain place in the story, and God puts it much earlier.
Yeah. Okay.
So the danger of going awry early on and then just drifting into disaster is something that he's setting the stage for a warning he's going to give here in the next chapter.
Gotcha. We're looking forward to that for sure. It seems like there definitely some basis to that, because again, it seems pretty strong language. How shall we escape again if we neglect so great a salvation? That seems pretty straightforward and blunt in terms of, and there's some people who try to argue this is, well, is now a good time to address who, in terms of Christians versus non-Christians? I mean, what?
Give me second half of verse 3.
Sure.
But let's hone in on neglect first before we go any further, because this also, as with drifting away, this also, it implies like action is required of us. We could fall into trouble simply by not doing something.
Right. It's not
rather than-
rejecting so great a salvation. It's neglecting it. It's not attending to it.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, some action is required. Steps need to be taken.
Okay.
And if they are not taken, then we are in fearful danger.
Gotcha. That makes sense. Now, this text doesn't tell us what those steps are in this verse, as far as I can tell.
No, we're like, well, what you should know at this point is you shouldn't neglect the great salvation, which he's about to keep talking about. But what exactly that means, well, we're not there yet. But
Sure.
this is one of those things where it's important for us. Like, we've got it cut up into chapters, and it's relatively rare for an English-speaking North American Christian to just read an entire book at a whack. But that is, in fact, how these books were experienced by their original audiences. And
Right.
what they were written for is they were written to be read out loud in public gatherings for the most part.
Right. That makes sense. Sure. So that what that entails is something to be revealed later on, that he's kind of setting the stage that he can tell us more about later on.
Yes. And so this great salvation, which at the first began to be spoken by the Lord and was confirmed to us by those who heard him. So this means the us here, the author and the hearers, because notice he puts himself in with them.
Mhm.
How shall we escape?
Yeah.
He sees himself sharing the danger that they are in.
Yeah.
And they together, this group, they're second generation Christians. They didn't hear this from the Lord.
Right. Confirmed to us by
those who heard him. So,
right. Okay.
So this is the group, like there's a group that heard Jesus,
Mhm.
and they turned around and started telling people. And this is that group. We heard it from the people who heard it from Jesus. And this is, I
Mhm.
mean, we think, how cool would it be to be that close?
Right.
For me to be like my daddy, was there at
Right.
the feeding of the 5,000. And I learned the story at his knee. Like, we're many, many, many generations removed. This was the first generation that heard it from the witnesses.
Right.
So they're like second generation Christians in that way, which also, by the by, is why I don't think Paul wrote it.
Right.
Paul this is not a thing that I think Paul would say. He makes a big deal about how he heard
Gospel
directly
right
from
from
the Lord.
Jesus. Right.
Yeah, in Galatians, as one born out of due time, admittedly, but nonetheless, he heard it directly from Jesus. So this is somebody else, somebody who heard it from the witnesses, but then continues in verse 4, and this is a big deal. God also bearing witness, both with signs and wonders, with various miracles and gifts of the Holy Spirit according to his own will. So whatever your position on the cessation of the gifts today might be, in this time,
Right.
everything that we read about in the New Testament is still happening.
Mhm.
And so it's not just we heard it from the first generation of witnesses. We heard it from the first generation of witnesses, and then the Holy Spirit showed up and showed us firsthand, confirmed it with signs and wonders
Right.
and gifts of the Spirit and miracles. And so we have no excuse for thinking that this, like, for doubt about this. We know.
No excuse not to drift away, and no excuse to neglect what we've heard from the first-hand witnesses and what we ourselves have seen with our own eyes.
Yes, exactly. So we've seen God confirm this ourselves,
Mhm.
and we heard it from the witnesses. And this is coming off of chapter 1. This is a much bigger deal. And he made a point in chapter 1, verse 5. He quotes from Psalm 2, and
Mhm.
down at the end, he bookends the other end of the chapter in verse 13 with Psalm 110. And both of these are messianic psalms about the Son of God going to war against his enemies.
Mm.
You are my son, today I have begotten you is the benign part of the psalm, but he ends up crushing the nations with a rod of iron.
Yeah.
And at the other hand, and sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. He is explicitly pointing up the possibility that how do we escape if we neglect the one whose footstool we will be if we become his enemies?
Right. Right. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. His enemies can't escape. Yeah. Where are you
Yeah.
going to go to get away from God? Ask Jonah how that went, which is not
right. And all things considered, Jonah's his friend. You could do worse than to be Jonah.
Sure. Sure. And I also notice, again, just thinking about some of the witness piece, even so, it strikes me that even when Jesus himself was speaking, the first spoken by the Lord, even Jesus's ministry is a ministry accompanied with signs and wonders. And so then when Peter and Paul do their ministry is accompanied with signs and wonders. So yes, you have the preaching of Jesus and the direct witness, but God was revealing the Father's and the Holy Spirit's testimony. And what's it Jesus says, if you don't believe me, believe my words, believe on the works, believe on the basis of the works, right? Peter and Paul do the same thing. And now this guy, whoever the author is saying, even in the second generation, those works are still present, that God is continuing to testify to the validity of this salvation.
Yes. So you have this continuous witness.
Well, that makes me want to get into a big discussion about continuationism more generally, but that's probably not the place for
it. I've actually heard this passage used, the verse 4 used as a cessationist argument.
Wow. That seems exactly wrong-headed to me.
On the grounds that, well, what they do is they'll leverage it. If you think anything at all ceased, then all of the gifts of the Spirit, the whole thing, it's all ceased. That was something that confirmed to that second generation, but we're past that point, is how that argument goes. It's an interesting idea. The only real problem with it is that it's just not at all what the text is saying.
Right. The text doesn't say. You would have to have that idea from somewhere else to important. I guess from an application interpretational perspective, it's something like, if God, whether it's to then or now, God has, and you said this earlier, just to emphasize, God has in fact not only given the testimony through Jesus and through the apostles, but he's also given the testimony of his own signs and wonders. And so this has been highly verified multiple times with multiple witnesses, which should call then us to be, so here's the action. We're to be earnest. We're to take and not neglect. There's a positive, be earnest, and a negative, don't neglect.
Yeah, exactly. And he hasn't laid out exactly what does neglecting look like? What does being earnest look like? There's more to come on that. He's going to lay that out, but he's just kind of at this point, kind of setting the table.
Sure. That makes sense. Well, and that's what a good arguer is going to do. This is the thesis I'm making. Would it be fair to say, and I'm just asking you, you're better Hebrews than I am. Is it fair to say that 2:1-4 is something like the thesis of where the book's going to go, or is this just one part of a larger?
Yes and no. I mean, in an important way, yeah, because he's laying out the tone for the warnings. But I would, if I'm going one place in the book, so this is off of what we're doing today, but let's do it anyway.
Okay.
Go to 8:1 real quick.
Sure. 8:1. All right. New priestly service.
Right. Now, this is the main point of the things we are saying. Anytime a biblical author says that,
you should pay attention.
You should probably believe them.
Right.
And this is actually one of my leadoff point when I teach on Hebrews is I take people here. And you've been in church all your life. You've heard many sermons out of Hebrews. You've maybe read a number of commentaries on Hebrews, none of whom treat the book like this is the main point of the things he's saying.
Right.
There's something really important about the way he's making his case, that we get a lot of true things that Hebrews is saying, but we miss how he's putting them together such that it culminates in the high priesthood of Jesus.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, as much as I've done Hebrews and played with the warning passages, I wouldn't have thought to make 8:1 the culminating point, even though the text says it just plain as day right there.
It's one of those when I saw that and it registered, and I couldn't tell you how many times I had to look at that passage before it finally registered, but it's like, how come no one told me?
Right. So just thinking then about if the looking at the high priesthood of Christ, is there an immediate way that you think to connect? I can guess, but how would you immediately connect the 2:1-4 warning we just looked at? How does that build up to this high priesthood of Jesus?
Oh, that's where he's headed. What he hasn't really talked about the priesthood of Jesus yet. But if you know your Old Testament well, he finished chapter 1 with Psalm 110.
Mm-hmm.
The Lord has sworn and will not relent. You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek.
I'm gonna just Psalm 110. Is that right? Let's just see them both. So he ends Psalm 1. That's right. Is it? Where is it at? You said he ends Psalm 1. Is that right? Or 110?
Oh, I'm quoting the wrong. No, I'm not. So he ends chapter 1.
Oh, there it is. Yeah.
With
there you are.
the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till you make your enemies your footstool. But if you keep reading Psalm 110.
Right. So to be clear, because there's going to be an audio version of this. So 113 says, but to which angel has he said, sit at my right hand till I make a footstool of your enemies your footstool. That's quoting Psalm 110. That's verse 1 of 110. Psalm 110.
Yep. 3 verses later,
mm-hmm.
The Lord has sworn and will not relent. You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Yeah. That is a linchpin in the argument of Hebrews. It is going to be very important. And again, he's setting up the dominoes right in the first chapter.
That's amazing.
Where if this is what Jesus, if this is who Jesus is,
mm-hmm.
then if he's this one that whose enemies are going to be made his footstool, and if on that basis we should be a little concerned about neglecting what he had to say,
right,
then it also follows that he is a priest after the order of Melchizedek.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. Right. That's phenomenal. I like that a lot. Again, I like how he settled it so early on and dropping little hints that I guess you're right. If you know your Old Testament really, really well, that'll ring. But if you don't, it's.
And even if you know your Old Testament well, you may not know where he's going with it yet.
Right.
But a little while later, when he starts to talk about Melchizedek, it's going to be, oh yeah. Right. Instead of like, time out, Bible dictionary. Who's Melchizedek again?
Oh, that's good.
So he is one of the things that my exegesis training under John Niemela at Schaeffer Seminary did for me is I learned how to read whole books deeply. And I cannot tell you what a blessing that has been, because you start to see this is genius level communication. This is done really, really, really exceptionally well. And it really is highly interconnected. It's the author, he knows where he's going, and he really is laying in the things that you're going to need to make sense of the later chapters in the early chapters.
That's so good. And again, I'm just going to use it as a way to say that going back to my early comment, obviously what you said is true. You don't, when you get to Hebrews 6 and 10, the big controversial passages, what you need is in those passages. But if you have here in 2 and other passages, that's going to help us understand what goes on those later, because he knows what he's doing. He's building those out.
Well, and because in the context, this is the thing that, because we read these in chunks, we tend to miss. If you're sitting in a church in Jerusalem, you've received this letter, it is being read.
Right, the whole thing.
And you hear chapter 6. What, 15 minutes ago? You were hearing chapter 2. Yeah.
So it's all right there in your mind. It's not like weeks and weeks later.
It's all together, all at once, and it's all immediately present to you. And it's really important to read these like as whole works, as if, you know, as if we're hearing them together, because that's how they were written to be read.
Right. I was teaching a Bible study just a few days ago, and I strongly recommended to my Bible study that just listen to entire books. If you're not a big reader, because I said, just listen, just get an audio Bible and just listen to the entire book, because they were intended to be read that way in the first place. Had a couple of people that, that's amazing. I'd never realized all these connections. Just putting it all together, I think helps a lot.
It really does. And if you ever get a chance, I'm forgetting the guy's name, Tom Meyer, maybe. His ministry is called Word Sower. He recites entire, huge swaths of scripture from memory.
Wow.
I happened to be at a church up in Minnesota on vacation when he was coming to their evening service and doing Revelation.
Oh, wow.
And he does King James, because King James he can get into anywhere.
Yeah.
So like even the Amish and Mennonite communities that don't let anybody in,
right,
will have him come, and because he's just reciting the Bible.
Right. Yeah, sure.
And so the entirety of his introduction was, imagine that we're in Asia Minor in a church, and we've gathered together this evening, and we have a letter from John. And then he starts.
Wow.
And 50 minutes later, he finishes.
Done.
And I got to tell you, I had read the book of Revelation several times, cover to cover before, but sitting and hearing it, it hits differently. And you see connections you would not have seen otherwise.
And I've had that experience as well. So I guess kind of two takeaways, at least for today anyway, is first of all, before we come back to the next video, dear viewer, read the Hebrews all the way through. Just listen to the whole thing. I think what Tim is arguing is going to make a lot more sense if you have read the book or heard the book a couple of times. You're familiar with the totality of it, right?
Yes.
And then second of all, and again, unless there's something you want to emphasize, kind of the big thing, we can worry about what the consequences. The fact that he doesn't mention this is probably no reason we shouldn't go further than the text, at least not in this passage. But what we're to do, take earnest heed. We'll find out what that means, I suppose, later on, and don't neglect the salvation. So there's an intentionality here, and there's a cost to not being intentional. Something like that. Am I summarizing you well?
Yes. Yeah. This is not an occasion where I should be, well, I feel dumb saying it this way, but this is not an occasion to be complacent, as if there's any time where complacency is good.
Sure.
But this is not a go into autopilot and assume that because nothing spectacular is wrong, I must be doing okay. This is something that takes affirmative attention.
That's actually, I think, really well said, because it's very easy to get caught up in the routine of life and then kind of subsume your Christian walk under the routine of life. And just I go to church and, I talk about the Bible from time to time, and I'm okay. And the author here seems to be saying, maybe not. We need to be, this is a big deal who this Jesus is. It's a really big deal. And so don't neglect, be earnest.
Yes.
Be very intentional about it.
And we'll talk about this when we get to some of the applications he's going to draw. Mm-hmm. But some of the applications he's going to very directly draw are things that are very hard, that are actually harder for us to do than they were for them to do. Difficult to execute in modern life. We the way our lives are put together just don't allow as easily for some of the things that he's going to talk about as specific things we should be doing.
Yeah.
And so it is going to take some attention from us. It will prove to be the kind of thing where drifting would be easy. Sure.
And then the last thing I would say, at the risk of getting off into some big theological issues, but I think it's fair here in this text, he's pretty clearly writing to believers, because I know it's a big debate in Hebrews arguments and passages and sermons is who's he writing to? This seems obviously about believers to me.
I would say Yeah, I would say yes, clearly. I would say my slam dunk early Hebrews argument for that is coming at the beginning of chapter 3.
Mhm.
Um,
But in
but
tone and setting of stage, I mean, it's hard to, without being slam dunk, it's hard to imagine drifting. People are clever and can make any argument they want, right?
right, but drifting away from what?
Right. And so neglecting a salvation seems different than rejecting it. And so it just seems like something that I've had and now I'm no longer attending to. So this just seems, and of course, there's the we. How will we? Well, I think the author of Hebrews probably assumed he himself was a believer. So it seems like it's just obvious that unless he changes his mind later, the tone that he's setting seems to be Christian, I need you to think about some important things.
Yeah, he clearly paints himself as part of the group, right?
Right.
How will we escape if we neglect so great a salvation, which was confirmed to us by those who heard the Lord? He is part of this group that he's talking to.
So,
And which is not to say that he couldn't come along, 2 chapters from now and differentiate himself in
Sure.
some way.
Sure.
But
and if that's
at
the
the
case,
moment,
the text needs to show that.
yeah, and we'll see that when we get to it, if we get to it. But at the moment, he is presenting
Right.
like his approach to them rhetorically.
Right.
At this point, you are supposed to be sitting in Jerusalem in your house church, listening to this letter and
Right.
hearing him say, I'm in the same boat with you.
Gotcha. Right. So the tonal expectation is whatever gets you later on. Right now, he's setting the table to say, believer, you need to pay attention because what's going on here is really, really important.
Yes.
Good. Well, good. I think we'll probably do next time. We're going to do the whole rest of the chapter, or
I think we could probably take 5 all the way to 18. Yeah.
okay. Well, let's pause it here if that's okay with you. Any final wrap? We've covered a lot here in these 4 verses. Doug, pretty deep. Anything that you feel like that's really important to pull out that we missed? Obviously, it's an important morning passage.
Yeah. I think we're good.
I think I'm pretty happy. Well, Tim, let's not overwhelm ourselves. As it happens, I'm out of coffee, which is always a good time to pause.
Amen.
All right. Well, I'm going to let you go. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time. All right.
Thank you so much.
God bless.